So, on one of the most remote islands in the entire world, in the far remote western Pacific Ocean, surrounded by currents that made it impossible for humans to sail there until just 700 years ago, the islands of New Zealand were a completely and utterly isolated world that had broken away from the other major land masses millions of years prior to the fall of the dinosaurs. Meaning that until Polynesians were able to navigate their way beyond the ocean currents that hide New Zealand in the western Pacific, the plant and animal species of these islands existed and evolved in near complete isolation for over 80 million years. So when those Polynesian voyagers, who would later become known as the Maori, first stepped foot onto those remote islands, that very moment was probably the closest that any human being has ever been to stepping foot in a real Jurassic world. The islands of New Zealand were home to over 70,000 unique species of animal and plant life, and within the first 100 years of human arrival, many of those major species began to vanish. One of those species happened to be the tallest and one of the largest birds to ever exist, the giant moa. Skeletal remains discovered on the South Island show that the moa stood up to 12 feet tall. Some could weigh in at over 500 pounds, and the oddest thing was that they didn't have wings. And I mean, they literally did not have wings. Over the course of 60 to 80 million years, these birds lived isolated on these islands, far away from any predatory land animals to fly away from. So they stopped flying and lived in such an abundant paradise that they grew to stand around 12 feet tall. And then, in the span of roughly 100 years, they were gone. This is Extinctions Through Time. The remote islands of New Zealand broke away from the extinct continent of Gondwana sometime around 80 million years ago. Really quickly, this is a series that I created in collaboration with Colossal Biosciences, who also has a YouTube channel that's worth checking out. The islands were completely devoid of any land mammals, meaning that there were no large predators from the time of the dinosaurs, as well as no presence of the mammalian predators who would soon be on their way. The islands of ancient New Zealand existed in near complete biological isolation, and in that isolation, over the course of tens of millions of years, the birds living on New Zealand with no need to fly became flightless and grew into some of the largest birds the world has ever seen. And in this primordial time, at least 9 different species of moa are known to have existed and thrived on these islands. And possibly there were more species of the moa that we just haven't discovered yet. The largest of the birds is known scientifically as Dinornis robustus, the South Island giant moa. This is the bird that could stand somewhere around 12 feet tall and could weigh in at over 500 pounds, taller than any known bird in the fossil record. The giant moa was completely wingless, and not like an ostrich where you can tell that the wings are there, however useless they may be. The giant moa did not have wings, nor any indication that the species had ever had wings. They evolved so completely away from flight on this utopian-like South Island that their wings had completely disappeared. Their only known predator in this western Pacific oasis was the Haast's eagle, the largest eagle known to have ever existed. Their wingspans could reach over 10 feet long, and paleontologists estimate that they could have attacked a moa swooping down at over 50 miles per hour. Julius von Haast, who first formally described the eagle's bones in 1871, called it a raptorial bird of enormous dimensions, and it was the only known threat to the giant moa. These giant moas lumbered through the dense forest and shrublands of both islands, covered in long, shaggy, reddish-brown feathers, as a Maori chief named Urupenipuhara confirmed in 1912 what older tradition had always held: the moa's name in Te Kura, the red bird. New Zealand was the very last landmass left untouched by mankind, the Earth's last pristine wilderness. As unlikely and hard to believe as it sounds, the earliest evidence of habitation on these islands only goes back 700 or 800 years. When the Polynesian ancestors of the Maori people first landed on New Zealand's northern shores sometime between 1200 and 1300 AD, they were not arriving in some remote, obscure primordial time in history. This was actually at the height of the medieval world. The world of Kublai Khan and Marco Polo, Edward I of England and William Wallace of Scotland, the Mali Empire under Mansa Musa. There were universities being built and established across Europe. In this fully formed medieval world that was currently ruling on top of the ruins of the ancient world, a group of Polynesian voyagers became the very first human beings to ever set foot on the New Zealand islands, and came face to face with an animal that had no instinct whatsoever when it came to interacting with a human being. The giant moa's only instinctual fear that we know of was the Haast's eagle. Later on, in some records, the Maori oral tradition recalled the moa as mostly docile, large birds that did not flee from people or any other creature walking around or below their eye level. It's been estimated that even medium-sized moa could feed around 50 people per day. By the time Montel was exploring New Zealand, it had been quite a long time since the Maori people or their ancestors had seen a moa bird. Modern paleontologists estimate that within just 100 years of the Polynesians' arrival in New Zealand, the moa had gone extinct. We could put that year somewhere between 1300 and 1400 AD, just around 600 to 700 years ago. When the moa vanished, the Haast's eagle soon followed, the apex predator that had ruled New Zealand's primordial skies for millions of years, gone within one generation because its primary prey source had also disappeared. And so, in this Maori proverb carried throughout the centuries until it was finally recorded by Europeans, ka ingaro I te ingaro ate moa, lost as the moa is lost. I hope to any Maori watching that I am somewhat pronouncing these well. By the time the last moa fell, Constantinople had just fallen as well. The Portuguese were beginning the age of exploration, and the Aztec Empire was at its height, soon to meet the Spaniards. The cornerstones of the modern world were being set into place, and New Zealand, the last large habitable landmass humans had ever reached, was still isolated and invisible to all of it. The first European to sight New Zealand's coastline was during an expedition led by Dutch explorer Abel Tasman of the Dutch East India Company in 1642, who was on a mission to map the mythical southern continent known as Terra Australis. And keep in mind, this was 2 centuries after the moa had already vanished. Upon arriving, he immediately learned how vicious and formidable the Maori warriors could be. He lost 4 sailors in a confrontation with Maori and left without setting foot ashore. The Maori defense worked, and it would be another 127 years until explorer Captain Cook finally arrived in 1769 to chart the islands properly for the first time. And in all the months spent sailing around the coastline, not a single member of his expedition encountered or saw any of the large bipedal birds. Most likely, the bird had already been gone for around 300 years. By the time New Zealand became a landmass recorded in European maps, the largest creature to ever exist on these islands was already a ghost of time. The Maori may have recorded them in oral traditions, but still, there was no physical evidence. That is, until 1839. That year, missionary William Williams was walking around the east coast of the North Island with his colleague William Colenso when the Maori people began telling them of a massive creature that their ancestors had known of in some long distant past. Williams wrote back to England describing what he'd heard, that local people spoke of some extraordinary monster said to have lived in a cave near the Wairoa, and that they'd been shown fragments of enormous bones pulled from riverbeds that no living person could identify. When he heard the same stories again at his mission station in Tauranga, he still described them as idle fables, since no Maori in living memory had actually seen one. He offered a large reward for proof, but for one reason or another, nobody ever claimed that reward. Now, there are a lot of conflicting accounts from these early periods. It is likely that the Maori people did have some concept of the massive creature that their ancestors had seen, considering the rock art depicting the moa birds scattered throughout the islands, but it is likely that they weren't able to provide the kind of scientific explanation that these early scientists were after. Meanwhile, in London, a bone fragment had landed on the desk of Richard Owen, one of the most respected anatomists in the world at the time. When a retired naval surgeon named John Rule brought it to him, a 6-inch section of thigh bone, he initially dismissed it as a marrow bone from an ox, but Rule persisted and told Owen that the bone had come from New Zealand and that the local tradition had held that it belonged to a bird of the eagle kind. So Owen begrudgingly took another look. He examined its internal structure, the pneumatic canals found only in birds, but he found the walls of the bones to be too thick, with a marrow cavity too large for any bird he or anyone else had ever seen before. He compared it against everything in the Hunterian Museum's collection, and nothing matched. And then, with the supreme self-assurance of a man who had spent his career reconstructing unknown animals from mere fragments, he made one of the most audacious predictions in the history of natural science. On November 12, 1839, Owen stood before the Zoological Society of London and announced, "So far as a judgment can be formed of a single fragment, and so far as my skill in interpreting an osseous fragment may be credited, I am willing to risk the reputation for it on the statement that there has existed, if there does not now exist, in New Zealand a struthious bird nearly, if not quite, equal in size to the ostrich." Rule had pushed Owen to take a second look, and now Owen was convinced. The Zoological Society published the paper only on the explicit condition, recorded formally, that the responsibility for the statements therein rests solely with the author. Typical. They thought Owen had lost his mind and was wildly out of his depth. And so Owen would spend 4 more years under intense scrutiny and doubt until the truth was finally discovered. On January 19, 1843, a large crate arrived at the Hunterian Museum's Hall of Giants, packed by Colenso and Williams from the riverbeds and swamp sites along the wilds of New Zealand's east coast, carried out through the mountains on foot. Inside the crate, leg bones nearly 3 feet long, enormous vertebrae, and rib bones the size of a grown man's forearm. Owen was there to open the box as well, and I like to imagine what this moment must have been like. These were explorers of a different kind. We tend to imagine explorers searching for ancient artifacts or lost cities, but I find explorers looking for lost species to be equally as interesting. From this discovery, these men would add an entirely new species to the natural history of the world, which is no less significant an achievement than discovering a lost civilization. 5 years later, he presented the world with Dinornis, the surprising bird. A leading member of the Zoological Society, who was previously one of the most skeptical voices in the room, now called it the greatest zoological discovery of our time. Typical. And suddenly, New Zealand was known around the world as the land of the giant moa. The German-born New Zealand explorer Julius von Haast, whom New Zealand's extinct Haast eagle is named in honor of, excavated cartloads of moa skeletons from the Canterbury swamps on the east side of the South Island, a massive bird that was hunted on basically an industrial scale until it simply ceased to exist. Years later, a preserved moa foot would be pulled from a cave near Queenstown in 1878, with skin intact and scales still visible. Then, several complete articulated skeletons were found in Pyramid Valley in 1938, lying essentially exactly as the birds had died 6 centuries before. And from these remains, science has been able to reconstruct the moa's full genome, identified its last meals, preserved from gizzard contents, recovered feathers, and even constructed its call, which resulted in a deep, resonating sound produced by an unusual looping trachea, which is shared only with swans and cranes, that would have rolled across a New Zealand valley like nothing alive in the world today. I'd love to be a fly on a tree when the Maori heard that for the very first time. The Moas extinction is, at least by the standards of paleontology, an unusually clear matter, which is almost never the case for extinct species. There was no climate catastrophe, no asteroid. New Zealand's climate was stable. Again, this is essentially the premier example of an untouched, pristine oasis. Recent genetic studies show that the Moa's population was not in decline before human arrival, and even one study found that the South Island giant moa was actually experiencing a population increase right up to the moment that Polynesian canoes reached these isolated shores. The bird simply had no behavioral template for a ground predator, no instinct to run from something at eye level, and within 100 years, it was gone. And when it went, the Haast eagle, with nothing left to hunt, immediately followed the moa into oblivion. And yet, the descendants of those first Polynesians to arrive in New Zealand, the Maori, did not let the moa disappear entirely, at least not from their memory or in meaning. In a culture where knowledge lived on through spoken word, passed from elder to grandchild around fires on the same islands where these birds once walked, the moa endured in a way that perhaps only oral tradition can preserve. Lost as the moa is lost became one of the most deeply held expressions in the Maori language, a phrase invoked not just for the bird, but for anything precious and irreplaceable that the world has swallowed whole. As the legends go, Maori chiefs wore its feathers as a mark of authority long after the last moa had vanished. Artists carved depictions of the Moa onto rock faces in the farthest reaches of both islands. In a culture without a written history, that kind of remembrance is their archive. And because of it, when European explorers finally arrived asking questions and exploring the islands, there were still Maori stories of those lost birds waiting to be told to the world. And so, in July 2025, Colossal Biosciences announced the South Island giant Moa as their newest de-extinction target. The primary source of the ancient DNA, a private collection of more than 300 Moa bones owned by Sir Peter Jackson, yes, the filmmaker who brought Middle-earth to life on these same islands. Scientists have already extracted around 24 DNA samples from Jackson's collection, combined with specimens from the Canterbury Museum, working toward complete genomes for all 9 species. The Moa's closest living relative turns out to be the tinamou, a small South American bird that can still fly, and Colossal has already built a reference genome from this bird as the genetic baseline. Crucially, the entire project is being coordinated by the Ngai Tahu Research Center. In Ben Lamb's own words, we've taken a different approach, where we are almost like a support function to the Maori. The people whose ancestors witnessed the disappearance of this great bird just 6 centuries ago are now playing a major part in directing the effort to bring their lost species back from extinction. From those first Polynesian canoes somehow reaching a geographically hidden and untouched shore sometime between 1200 and 1300 AD, to Richard Owen staking his entire reputation on 6 inches of shin bone back in London, to the Maori elders telling Walter Montel that their grandfathers had actually seen these birds, and now to modern-day scientists reading a genome from bones in a filmmaker's private collection on the same islands where all of this began. Looking at the once pristine world that the Moa once roamed, and their extinction within just a century of the arrival of humans, it again forces us to ask the question, what do we owe to a species whose extinction we may have directly caused when 6 centuries later, we now have the tools to give it another chapter in our world? Personally, I think of all the things that modern humans find themselves doing, I can hardly think of anything that's more important than preserving and, when we can, resurrecting parts of our lost world. And I look forward to looking up at the Moa someday. Like and subscribe for more history of extinct species, and I'll catch you next time.